This is Telling the Story, a podcast dedicated to exploring faith, spirituality, arts, and culture, hosted by Ninth Hour Theatre Company located in Ottawa, Canada. Thank you for joining us for our first podcast series discussing C.S. Lewis's popular tale, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the second of 7 stories in the Chronicles of Narnia. This Christmas, Ninth Hour is presenting a live theatrical production of this beloved classic. For more information, visit our website, ninthhour.ca. That's number 9th-hour.ca, or follow the links in the description. In this podcast series, we thought it would be interesting to discuss The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in more detail, to not only deepen and enrich yours and our understanding of this favorite story, but for the sheer pleasure of it. We also think you'll enjoy getting an insider's look at many of the artistic and production decisions that Ninth Hour Theatre Company makes in putting together this show. So, grab a drink and a favorite snack, maybe some Turkish Delight, and settle in for a stimulating ride into the wardrobe and the world of theater magic. Welcome to episode 2 of Telling the Story. I'm your host, Charlie, and today we are going to dig into War and Peace in Narnia. Today, I've got 3 guests with me. I'm very excited to have this conversation. Returning with me from last time is my co-host, George Dutch. He's the Associate Artistic Director of Ninth Hour Theatre Company. George studied acting at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver with internationally renowned theatre director Gunduz Kalik during the 70s. Then joined his ensemble in Northern Australia for 5 years, where he taught a performance class in a university theatre program during the 80s. George was director of the drama ministry of Dominion Chalmers United Church in the 2000s. He has contributed to Ninth Hour's mandate since its inception as both dramaturge, artistic associate, and an actor in many of the shows. George played Screwtape in the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and also was Sigmund Freud in the Canadian premiere of the hit play Freud's Last Session. George was in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 2018 as Mr. Beaver, and this year he's on the directing team for our 2023 production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Also with me today is Ian McMullen, returning with us from last time as well. And Ian studied theater at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick. He still calls the East Coast home, but has been living in Ottawa for 7 years. He's worked with many companies in Ottawa as both a director and actor. Some notable acting credits include Rodrigo in Othello and the Spartan Herald in Lysistrata, both at the Gladstone Theatre. Lindsay Buckingham and Stevie Nicks is my girlfriend at the 2022 Ottawa Fringe. And Peter Pevensey in Ninth Hour's 2018 production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Ian also founded Leaping Mammal Collective, a company that produced 2 shows at the Ottawa Fringe, Blanket Fort in 2018 and Exterminators in 2019, both of which Ian directed. Exterminators received a Rito Award special mention for ensemble physicality. Ian is playing Mr. Tumnus in this year's production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, our only returning cast member. Welcome, George. Welcome, Ian.
Hello. Happy to be back.
Me too.
Great. And joining us today as a special guest is Dr. Richard Feist. Dr. Richard Feist teaches and researches in the Faculty of Philosophy at St. Paul University. He's also the director of the Masters in Public Ethics program, which is housed in the Faculty of Philosophy. Dr. Feist has published in a variety of areas such as metaphysics, philosophy of science, and philosophy of mathematics. He currently works mostly in ethics, the history of the discipline, and military ethics. But he works and teaches in the philosophy of literature, and he just taught a summer course on ethics and literature, as a matter of fact. He has also interestingly taught a course on ethics and the Lord of the Rings. He has a couple of books and articles in the pipeline, but especially relevant here is a forthcoming book, an edited collection of essays on Jesuits and science fiction. He is also a longtime fan of all things C.S. Lewis, and maybe there's a course on Lewis that will come out of this conversation. Who knows? Welcome, Dr. Feist.
Thank you. And
forget the title stuff. We can just go with Richard.
All right, I'll call you Richard from now on.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, happy to be here.
So War and Peace in Narnia is our topic today. We want to unpack a little bit more of why does war feature so prominently in the Chronicles of Narnia? And then also, what exactly is the war in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe even about? And then also, what is C.S. Lewis's history or relationship with war, and how has that influenced him as a writer and as a creator? And before we dig into some of this, I think we just want to recap a bit of the plot of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe so people can follow along if you're unfamiliar with what the story is even about. And I'll go to George Dutch, Artistic Associate of Ninth Hour, to give us a bit of a recap of the plot of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Sure, Charlie. The story features 4 children who are sent out of London during World War II, the Blitzkrieg of London. Bombs were falling on the city, destroying large structures in the city, and people were threatened. Their lives were threatened by this bombing, of course, and a lot of parents sent their children into the country for shelter, for safety. So it features these 4 children who end up in the country in a big house of a distant relative. And while they're exploring the house, they encounter a wardrobe, which Ian wants me to remind everybody is a wooden box standing upright that acts as a closet, because many of those houses didn't have closets. They had wardrobes. And in this particular story, the wardrobe was full of old coats. And the children make their way through those coats and end up in this fantasy world, this fantastical world called Narnia. And it's about their adventures in Narnia, particularly how they encounter the tyrant of Narnia called the White Witch, who rules over Narnia, where it's always winter and never spring, never Christmas. And they're all awaiting the return of this great lion called Aslan, who promises to return and bring spring with him. And there's a prophecy that the witch fears, which is when humans appear in Narnia, it means it's the return of Aslan is imminent. So we follow the adventures of these children as they try to navigate their way through Narnia and encounter the witch and Aslan. That's a synopsis of the story at this point.
Right. Good plot points, good reminder. And just so people can follow along if we start to reference aspects of the plot again, in case you're unfamiliar with it, or in case it's been a while since you've read it or took in any of the various movies or TV productions that have been done over the last several decades. Richard, perhaps we'll start with you to ask a bit, what's your relationship with, Lewis and C.S. Lewis in your life, and why are you such a big diehard fan?
I think it starts by going through his fellow inkling, Tolkien, whom I discovered, like many people, you discover Tolkien when you're younger, and you fall in love with the whole story, and of course, the world that he constructs. And it was through Tolkien that I started studying Tolkien's background in the war, and then eventually was led into studying and thinking about the Inklings. And that's how I got into C.S. Lewis. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that Tolkien was, when they were gathering at the Bird and Baby, that famous pub.
Right. We talked about this a bit on our last podcast.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But carry on, yeah.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was researching for this course on Tolkien, I rediscovered a bunch of stuff about Lewis that I had read earlier, but was how often Lewis would be one of the big critics of Tolkien.
Really?
Right? And Tolkien was always pretty annoyed by these criticisms that Lewis would deliver at the Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby as they call it, that he would often go back and just rewrite everything. Like Lewis would say, don't name that guy that, just name him this, or change a few things. And Tolkien was always just so deeply offended by this stuff, according to what I read, that he would go back and rewrite the whole thing. Right?
Really?
So
but he would take it in. He would take the criticism in.
He'd take it very seriously. He'd be deeply offended, and then kind of, I'll show you, and I'll make this way better. And I think that's what's interesting about Lewis, like for me, was he was a critic of Tolkien, right? And I greatly admired Tolkien. I was fascinated with all the published stuff. And then as I started to dig into the archives of, the unpublished stuff, and I was starting to see something that I thought maybe that Lewis would have seen in the bar, right? And some of it was I can see why Lewis went, this is awful. Like, change some
Really?
stuff. Yeah,
Interesting.
so I think that's sort of a credit to Lewis in the sense of being, as he was a critic as well, right? He was
right.
a well-known literary
critic, that's right.
Absolutely, and a
Right.
medievalist, and a lot of things that crop up again in his work. But it was through Tolkien that I discovered Lewis, and and then just more and more as I read more Tolkien, I would go back to Lewis, and so. But yeah, maybe a course is forthcoming on this.
Oh, and most people would be absolutely fascinated to know that those two knew each other and influenced each other's writings and faith and everything, it seems, you know?
Yep.
Richard, do you know if at the time that Lewis was criticizing Tolkien or acting as a literary critic, was he a Christian at that time, or was there a clash of worldviews? Because Tolkien was a Catholic, right, at that time?
Yeah.
So was part of his criticism coming out of a different worldview, a different set of assumptions?
I don't think so much as that. I think it was just more straightforward literary. Like, some of the stuff that, like some of the stuff that Tolkien was bringing was surprisingly goofy, right? It was. I mean, I was just like, really? Like, like some of the early, like Aragorn and Strider, and the development of that character was originally a hobbit named Trotter.
Interesting.
And Lewis was often saying, like, no, this is not working. And I guess I think so. I do think it was more from a literary perspective rather than a religious one. But, that's an interesting thought. I certainly think that, like in my travels through academia, I haven't really come across anybody who's done a full-length study of the question of Lewis's influence on Tolkien. Because it's always usually Tolkien's influence on everybody, right?
Yeah.
But there's more scholarship being done where you're finding out how much, not derivative, but in the sense that Tolkien was part of a tradition, right? A long tradition of British fantasy. And Lewis fits into that as well. But to parse all that out, I'm not quite sure.
Do you know if they discussed war as a topic? Because
yes,
battles and war
did.
features in
Absolutely.
their
Tolkien was both of them. The First World War,
Yes.
completely looms large in everything they did, right? And when I taught a course on Tolkien, we did a lot of stuff on war and the just war tradition and what kind of ideas came out in that tradition that you can find implicit in Tolkien's works. And the same thing with Lewis, because I don't think either of them really come out really that clearly, because both of them, they're literary artists, so they're trying to contextualize it within a story, right?
Right.
So they're not writing philosophical monographs, right? So it's a different kind of read. But yeah, I mean, they were deeply affected by it, and both of them being sort of very scholarly minded. Both of them, they're university profs, and they're well versed in a lot of Western history. They've encountered all the great thinkers in certainly like the church tradition. So like Tolkien and Lewis knew people like St. Augustine and Aquinas and all those great thinkers, and up through the secularized version of just war theory, like Hugo Grotius and people like that. They would have read those guys.
Do you know? We know Chronicles of Narnia was written post World War II. Do you know when Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit do you know when those were written?
Well, those are all The Hobbit's earlier, like in the 1920s, and then later on when The Hobbit became so famous, and they were asking for the sequel to The Hobbit, and then they got the Silmarillion. I don't know if you're familiar with that work.
No.
Okay, the Silmarillion is one of Tolkien's works that is just, I mean, I like it, but it's not something you would expect if you read The Hobbit, right?
Is it more science fiction?
Well, it's more, it's like reading almost Bible stories.
Interesting.
Right? Without the kind of sort of swashbuckle nature of those stories.
Right.
It's really sort of a Bible meets Homeric mythology meets Norse myths. Right.
Wow.
So yeah, it's as Tolkien said, I deliberately wrote it in what he called the high style. So the characters, which is why a lot of people have trouble relating to Homer, and not because the characters are gods. Right. So how do you relate to a character who's a god? Right. It's it's a certain kind of read. As opposed to reading about little hobbits running around. Right. Then all of a sudden you're reading about kind of godlike divine figures.
Right.
And so that's what Tolkien tried to publish next. And they said, no, that's not working. Have you got anything else? And then I'm kind of glossing over a bunch of stuff. But then for the next couple of decades, he was working on the Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
And that was like setting a story, bringing the hobbits in, connecting it up, because the original Hobbit doesn't really connect very well with the Lord of the Rings, so we had to go back and re-rig the Hobbit to make it work better.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier several times that both Tolkien and Lewis are steeped in the tradition of just war theory. Is that what you said? Just war theory? Can you explain what just war theory is?
Basically, and we can get into a little more of this, but if you think of the ethics of war in terms of a taxonomy, right? Different approaches to war.
Sure.
And what are the ethics of war? You have two extremes, which actually, like most extremes, they kind of cohere in the end. But one extreme is realism, where war is, there's really no ethics in war. The game of war is just to win, and you do whatever to win. You try and avoid it, right? Because it escalates and you don't know what's going to happen. But in the end, there really isn't an ethic once the war gets going.
So just, in other words, do whatever you can to win, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we just bring it down to a very simple thing, if you're attacked, you're going to try and avoid it. You're going to try and run. But if you're cornered or whatever, you're going to do anything to win.
Right.
But you will fight.
Right.
Like you're going to fight. Like, don't mess with me, and I'm going to fight back. That's a realist position. The other extreme is what most people think they are, and that's a pacifist, right? No, I don't believe in war.
I love that you said that most people think they are.
Well, when I teach my courses on military ethics, I usually start. I shouldn't say this in a podcast. I'm giving my secrets away. But anyways, I always say, who is a pacifist? And most people put up their hands, and they always say the same thing. Well, I would never start a fight.
Right.
And even if I got hit once, I might Christianly turn the other cheek. Right. But there's going to be a point where there's no return. I'm going to. Right. That's not a pacifist.
Right. I see.
The pacifist is basically really hardcore, kind of like a Gandhi figure, where under no circumstances do I believe in violence.
Wow.
That's pacifism. That's a hardcore view.
I will let them kill me. I will let them persecute me.
That's right. And it gets even rougher. Like, I'm not going to defend others. I'm not going to defend. Like, pacifism is a really, arguably, an extreme position.
Right.
Very few people hold that.
Because it's sort of an absolute, right?
It is an absolute.
That violence is never, ever justified.
That's right. And there's different versions of pacifism, like in the sense of, pacifism in the sense of it's not effective, so we look for other means, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is war is absolute, and there's no justification for war, right?
There never is in that position, right?
Now, Lewis and Tolkien, to get back to the just war thing, that's in the middle, right? So it says something like this, and I'll just end on this note so we can kind of pick up on more of this stuff. But it says that war is not intrinsically an evil, right? It's kind of inevitable. So what we want to do is put as many moral parameters on it as we can. But it's not necessarily an evil, right? It's like the pacifists, no, it's an intrinsic evil. The realists say it's not really anything, you just avoid it. But the just war tradition does allow what some people would say is kind of a militarist notion that war can be justified and it can have a good result. Right. And you do see that in Tolkien and Lewis.
Right.
As we can get into a little
later. Would you say just to add to this, are we here, in the West, I put air quotes, of course, up, are we steeped in the just war tradition too, simply because of all these stories we've read? Have they impacted us that there's a justifiable war, and it's hard to shake that notion?
Well, think about, if we want to bring in a contemporary issue, look what's going on in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Much of the rhetoric that we hear out of our politicians, and as you say, in the West,
Right.
talking about the kind of a righteous thing to defend democracy. This is a war to defend democracy.
Right.
That is a justification for the use of force.
Right. Whether
Absolutely.
people necessarily agree or believe in the justification, it still is a justification that exists.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's regarded kind of
Right.
like this is a good position. We're opposing tyranny. We're defending the Western way of life. And we're not just defending a way of life. We're defending something that we would say is a good.
Right,
This
right.
democracy is not just another means of government. This is a good form of government
Right.
that we do not want to fall.
Right.
So
Wow.
you hear a lot of that rhetoric.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And most politicians, they talk like just war theorists.
Yeah.
Pretty
Oh, do
well.
they? Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
sure. Well,
But it's
I
the
mean-
only way to justify what's happening. I mean, you have to have
Well,
an explanation, I suppose.
If, just imagine if a politician talked like a realist. Well, we're just going to go in there. Now that we're in, all bets are off.
yeah,
right?
yeah.
You know, I mean, that is,
I often felt like,
Never talk
this
like
is
that.
my opinion, of course. I often felt like on some level, like 9/11 felt like revenge rather than just, but that's just my opinion. But I have no conclusion on it. It's just more like it felt revengey, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
And I, to this day, still have not sorted out like position on violence and war. Like I'm still struggling to. Like I feel like I'm constantly flexing, and it kind of depends on what's happening tomorrow. It's almost like I can't seem to pinpoint the exact position I have on anything. So yeah. No, that's interesting. So they were steeped in the just war position, and they wrote. And maybe Lord of the Rings, of course, very popular, filled with battle scenes and war. And I know, Ian, you're a big fan of Chronicles of Narnia. You're also a big fan of Tolkien's writings as well?
Yes, I'm not as familiar in terms of I haven't read those books the amount of times that I've read the Narnia books, simply because of the nature of the language. And I can
Right.
knock out the Chronicles of Narnia in a weekend. I can't do that with any of the Tolkien books.
Because it's so long.
Because
you
it's so
mean?
long, and I'm just
yeah.
not a fast reader. But yeah, I
Right.
am a big fan. And after the podcast ends, we can talk for hours about where the Entwives are. That's
Okay.
that's sort of an inside joke in the Tolkien world.
Is it? Wow,
Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm not in that world. I don't
Yeah.
know the reference, but
Yeah.
Well,
that's...
you're welcome to enter the world.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Come on in and we'll talk about it.
Okay. And George, do you have as much familiarity with Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's writings as you do C.S. Lewis's?
I don't. I'm not a big fan of fantasy or science fiction.
Right.
I've read a few of the classics in the canon, but I haven't read Lord of the Rings. I saw the first movie. And to tell you the truth, I fell asleep during it.
Oh, we've lost people listening to this podcast. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's it took me a while to get around to watching them, but I definitely binge watched them.
Yeah.
But I haven't read the Lord of the Rings books at all. I like Ian, I'm a bit of a slow reader. Like I'm really having to reread paragraphs over and over again before I can move forward.
Yeah, and I think, part of one of the reasons why the Lord of the Rings can be a slog in places to read, right? I teach philosophy, so I'm used to slog reading, right?
Right.
It doesn't fizz. I'm used, not all reading is easy, but just because it's not easy doesn't mean it isn't worthwhile, So I've said that many times to students. But when you think about what these authors were trying to do, like when you think about Lewis, he's got his audience, right? And it's a certain kind of an age group. And he is, as he says, I forget where he says it, maybe you guys will know, but he said, I want to give kind of religion a chance and take the stained glass out of it, right? And contextualize it in narrative, right? So that's what he's doing. And he's trying to contextualize fairly ordinary, arguably kind of British values of the time within the context of a narrative. Tolkien, on the other hand, this guy was a philologist, so he started off with languages, right? So
What's that word? What
That's
did you say?
philologist, right?
What's that?
That's basically the study of languages.
Okay.
Modern philology kind of would be regarded as linguistic,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Like study of linguistics. So it's the ancestor of that. But philology is very kind of a 19th century type of discipline. But it was very concerned with language. And that's where Tolkien was extremely interested, because he was a scholar Like Lewis, he was interested in medieval works, but he was a scholar of like Old English, right? So Tolkien wrote a lot of stuff on Beowulf, right? And that's a slog to read because for a modern English reader, you really can't read that. That's Old English, right? So that's pretty well unintelligible. Like if you think Shakespeare's hard, go to Chaucer, which is even harder. But then Beowulf, forget it. But that's what Tolkien is trying to do: is articulate an Anglo-Saxon version of the world. So like he thought Shakespeare was too French.
Really?
Right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Of all things
it's those Normans came in and ruined England. That was Tolkien's view of things.
Oh,
right?
my.
Oh, yeah. So Tolkien's a really kind of a bit fascinating guy, but a real throwback. But he was trying to really rewrite, he was trying to write, as is often said, like this narrative for Britain. Well, more like England.
Tolkien was?
Yeah. He's trying to write sort of like Homeric myths for England. So that's why some of the writing is just, kind of goes over the top. So it feels like you're reading Homer or whatever.
Wow.
So that's why it can be a slog to read some stuff of Tolkien. I fully understand that. Some stuff zips along, and then some stuff. Oh my goodness. Does not. So no, and you don't read it in a weekend.
No,
absolutely.
We were talking earlier before we started the podcast about how in the Chronicles of Narnia, almost every story seems to feature battle or war. And then we sort of said, with the exception, most prominently, of course, of The Magician's Nephew, the creation of Narnia, although there's battle in that one, but it's quite the battle of the soul in that one, very specifically with Diggory and Queen Jadis. So why do you think? Maybe it's obvious, maybe it isn't. Why? Because now that we've done this production a couple times and very familiar that there's large battle scenes in it, and of course on a theater stage, that's a challenge in sort of conveying such action because it's theater, so you don't have the ability to do it like a movie does. And it's unavoidable. It's an unavoidable part of the story. And of course we know C.S. Lewis wrote the sort of allegorical to the Christian story, the Christian themes, it seems. But like, why such prominent focus on battle and war and swords and archery? Because there's weapons and everything going on. Why is a lot of that found in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe specifically, when it seems like in that story there's the deep magic of Narnia, and you almost think, well, couldn't it just be solved with some deep magic and some, I don't know, some forgiveness? Like, why do they have to go to war? Why are the children given weapons by Father Christmas? To fight this battle. They're children. It's an interesting thing that the children are like the prominent battle heroes. And I was wondering what some of your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think there's probably a variety of reasons, but one is a very old thought about war that you can trace back to the Greek writer Thucydides, right? And that is that war, these conflict, right? Violence and conflict is where your soul really is on display.
Oh,
right? Like war sometimes has been regarded as a teacher. Right? Suffering in the history of philosophy has been regarded as a kind of teacher, right?
Suffering,
and then what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? But so conflict has been largely seen in many philosophers as really one of the fundamental driving forces of history, and a creative force, right? So when you look at philosophers like Hegel, philosophers like Nietzsche, they talk a lot about of conflict, and even thinkers like Kant and whatnot, they too have these elements of war as something you try to overcome, but it's nonetheless, it's a part of human history. So I think getting back to Lewis and Tolkien, they realize that. They realize that war with children, war affects everybody.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
People are not, there's no part of the population that's hidden from war. Right? That, that old, you might not be interested in war, but war is always interested in you.
Ooh,
right? That
yeah.
old saw. So I think that's something that Lewis and Tolkien would have definitely tried to put and contextualize. And Lewis, of course, says repeatedly he's trying to teach children values.
Okay,
right?
explicitly saying so.
And
yeah.
things that are worth. There are things in the world that are worth fighting for.
Right.
And
right.
there is evil in the world that wants to do away with the good things and all that kind of stuff. And everybody's engaged in this general struggle.
Right.
So it's a cosmic element to it. Like it's a very metaphysical thing, as we say, like theological, metaphysical, that kind of stuff. That it's not, war is not just sort of this thing on earth. It transcends that. It's part of our existence.
And stories allow like this great, I don't know, there's a fictional story allows people to take it in almost with no ambiguity, with the exception of someone trying to be a rabble-rouser. Like no one would read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, once again, with the exception of someone trying to be a contrarian.
Yeah.
No one would read it and think the White Witch is the good guy and Aslan's the bad guy. Like it's almost like you couldn't possibly interpret it that way. But you could, once again, if you're being contrarian, I think, and deliberately sort of, trying to be argumentative. But that's what's kind of nice about fiction and stories is there's not a lot of ambiguity in the sense that, Narnia isn't all that great under the White Witch. It's kind of obvious, and it seems like everyone agrees with that. Even the people following the witch seem to agree.
Well, I just what George, what you mentioned in your synopsis, like that line about it's always winter, never Christmas. Like how mean can you be? That's the worst.
Yeah.
That's absolutely the worst. So yeah, you're right. It's when evil does dominate.
Right.
What do things look like? And I think also with some of the critters in Narnia, like certain animals that are just, well, those are just good. You follow robins and, they're great critters and everyone knows that. Right? Like who doesn't know that robins are awesome?
Yeah, who doesn't like a talking animal, a little...
Yeah,
right.
exactly. So that I always found interesting about Lewis. He just picks up on a lot of everydayness, even in this crazy territory he calls Narnia. There's a lot of very and of course Lewis... That's actually part of a lot of literature at that time. You find it in James Joyce and a lot of this sort of real deep respect for ordinary lives, right? Because Joyce's retelling of the Homeric story in Ulysses is just an homage to the ordinary man.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's really cool. And that's hard. That's a slog to read too.
Yeah, no doubt. And I know, Ian, you mentioned in our last podcast about Lewis writing some of these stories for the common man, meaning, of course, the ordinary man. And do you have anything more to elaborate on that or dig deeper onto what your thoughts were on that when you mentioned it last time?
Well, I think, and I wouldn't know Lewis as well as some of the others in the room, but I think he was in part also just trying to reach a pretty broad audience. And I think he, dedicating this to a niece of his or, no, it was his goddaughter.
One of the Inklings... daughters, Barfield, was it Barfield was the last name, I think. Apparently is the goddaughter of Lewis, and that kind of inspired him. Sorry, go on.
And her name is Lucy.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think in writing this for kids and wanting to reach a wide audience, there's a lot of that. I actually re-listened to the book on audiobook this past weekend, and at the beginning of the story, he repeats like 9 or 10 times, like, "Oh, but Lucy left the door of the wardrobe open because she knew it was irresponsible for anyone to shut themselves into a wardrobe," which is funny when you mentioned like trying to teach kids lessons.
Right.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is just, I think he was wanting to reach a broad audience with this story, and in a way, I think war is a theme that does allow you to do that, or at least like.
And they had just lived through a war.
And they had just lived through a war.
England.
And so, it's something that young and old, can all relate to at that point in time, or have all experienced at that point in time.
I also think there's an ethical issue at work with Lewis there, because think about the consequences of war. There's a lot of negative consequences to war. One of them is you create a lot of widows and orphans, right? Because soldiers tend to be men, and they tend to be young men. So children are greatly affected by the loss of a parent, and many children during World War II in the West lost their parents or lost people close to them because of war. And I think Lewis had tremendous empathy for those children because he lost his mother to cancer when he was 9 years old. He knew what it was like to lose a parent. And I think the children feature prominently because of that, because that ethical issue. He wanted to reach out to children. He wanted to do something for children. He wanted to help save children, even at the level of saving their souls, right? Which is what really goes on at a certain level, at that transcendent level in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yeah. So I think we should also spend some time talking about the negative consequences of war and how Lewis's worldview, as it's presented in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how it deals with that.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll take a short break here, but when we get back, we'll dig right into that question, George. You are listening to Telling the Story, a podcast by Ninth Hour Theater Company dedicated to exploring faith, spirituality, arts, and culture. Special gratitude goes out to Nigel Harris of Bare Bones Studio. For more information, go to barebonesstudio.godaddysite.com. That's Bare Bones Studio. It's with great joy that we record this podcast in an intimate setting where genuine conversation can take place. Thank you to Bare Bones Studio. And now, back to the podcast. All right, welcome back, everyone. And George just left us off right before the break, talking about digging into some of the negative consequences of war, maybe some of the less obvious ones, perhaps even as well. Of course, you've studied war ethics a fair bit, Richard. I wonder if you could get us started on some of your top thoughts there. Especially some of the less obvious ones, and maybe also what do you think Lewis was really trying to accomplish with this story, especially post World War II?
Charlie, can I just interrupt
there?
Okay. I too want to hear what Richard has to say about that, but because we have a former Pevensey child here who played Peter in our 2018 production.
Ian, we're talking about Ian here.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship to that whole war theme or that ethical issue that I brought up, that Lewis plants so firmly in the story about children without parents entering Narnia.
Yes. And we touched on it too. It's at least going back to the play and getting looking at it through the lens of Peter and through the lens of a child who's come in and encountered this. If anyone is unfamiliar, Peter is the oldest Pevensey child, and he's of an age where actually being sent away from the city with his siblings, he could have been a soldier. He was 1 year. His age is at the point where he could have gone to war.
What was his age? Do you know?
15, 16.
15, 16.
So he was
wow.
Or it never mentions in the book exactly what ages they are, but Peter very much feels like he's at that age, and Peter in Narnia gets lessons from Aslan about battlefield strategy, and just practical, put your centaur soldiers here and this here sort of thing. But it does really just feel inevitable in that story, and it feels like they come into Narnia, and there's almost no question they have to fight. They see what the witch has done to the world, and what the witch has done to all of the inhabitants of Narnia.
By they, you mean the Pevensey children?
The Pevensey, yes, yeah.
Okay.
They come into this world, always winter, never Christmas, and they see the tyranny and the.
They have a sense of fresh injustice about it, right? The kids, it's they're almost learning with the injustice as they go.
They're learning, and they're just sort of, I guess, seeing the oppression and seeing that it is always winter. And then Edmund directly also encounters the witch and encounters her lying right away, and encounters that sort of evil on a first hand, and he watches her, pull him in with magic and trickery and deceit, and then quickly
discard him,
and get ready to, end him. And so the Pevensey children all sort of see the tyranny that the Narnians are under, and then Edmund in himself really sees firsthand the evil of the witch, and I think lying is a very important part of that. And so. Yeah, it feels like a moment for the kids, or at least for how I came to Peter last time, is a moment for Peter of growing up to face the fact of war, and growing up to encounter a fight that you do have to fight. And so they do. Like then they, in that moment, there's not that much debate about in Narnia about, oh, do we need to fight this? It's always clear. They're like, what they have is tyranny and oppression, and what they need is freedom and hope and joy that Aslan brings, and so they fight. They fight for it.
And in their world at that time, they fled the city to be to the countryside to escape the World War II. And now they finally get a chance in another world to be part of the fighting, whereas in the real world, they just are kind of like put aside to be protected instead of being the victors. And it's just an interesting, it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition going from protected and kind of sent away to suddenly like, we're relying on you entirely to win this war, and we can't win it without you.
It's I think it's part of the fantasy of it that it is sort of simplified down to like, these are the good creatures and these ones are the bad, and there's no like, well, this centaur's brother is now evil. It's just these are the bad ones and we have to get rid of them, and these are the good ones and we have to protect them.
Right. Yeah, the demons and ghouls that she calls up to fight her battle are not the good guys. Whereas the beavers and, the fawns and, and although the fawn, Mr. Tumnus that you're playing, he's got some complications.
Yeah, he does.
And we can talk about that perhaps later with, once again, in the theme and topic of the ethics of war and the fact that sometimes in war people do things they would not normally do when it's not war, and they would, question themselves if they only knew what they were doing. Anyhow, and back to that question, Richard, about the negative consequences of war, especially the unexpected ones, and I don't know. Feel free.
I was just thinking of picking up on the point that you mentioned when Edmund first encounters the White Witch. And one of the things that always jumped out at me, and I thought it was a very clever move on Lewis's part, was that when the witch says to him, you're kind of cold, so I'm going to give you something hot to drink. And he's like, thank you. And then she says, do you want something? You can't drink without having something to eat.
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah. And then she says, well, what do you want? Right? And then he says... Right,
Turkish Delight.
That's right. I mean, I remember when I read that, I was like, "Well, okay."
It's not what I would have asked for.
It's not what it just leapt to my mind.
I guess it's his comfort food,
But what I think Lewis was doing there, which is really interesting, and it's sort of the inevitability of evil getting into the world, and it's reflected in one of Lewis's essays, "Men Without Chests." Right, if you've read that one, it's part of a collection that's bound up called "The Abolition of Man."
I have heard of that.
Men Without Chests. Anyways, put that aside for a second. But basically, Edward is easily manipulated because he's either somewhat rational, right? It's like, well, we don't know if the witch is bad or whatever, and then kind of saying we don't know this and being like overly logical.
Right.
Like, well, yeah, it's true you don't know that, but you're with your family.
How can we believe these other people saying?
And so there is that kind of contrarian logic chopping thing that this is why Plato said nobody under 30 should learn logic and philosophy, right? Because they can use it for bad purposes because it's too abstract. But on the other hand, Edmund is also trapped by his appetite, right? Because she food and drink, right? So she bypasses sort of, as Lewis would say, the chest part of people. So and that's kind of goes back to Aristotle, but basically it's sort of that practical kind of reasoning, right? It's not driven by the appetites. It keeps the appetites in control, but it's not too abstract like your purely reasonable, logical side. And she manages to bypass that. Right, and easily corrupts this kid, just easily. Right, like bang, as you said, she just manipulates him like nothing.
And every time you watch the play or read the story, you're always like, "Not this time, Edmund! Don't fall for it." You want the story to go differently.
But that's it. But that I think is Lewis saying that we're all corruptible, right, and very easily. right? We don't have to be, but man, is it easy to corrupt the beast we call a human being. It's so, because we're multifaceted, we're complex entities that are trying to organize all these different sides, like, you know, you're purely logical, your appetite, and this sort of, as Lewis calls, this kind of, you know, practical reasoning that comes, like, you know, you feel it, right? But it's not really in your gut like an appetite, but it's sort of like a sentiment of the heart.
Right.
And Edmund is just, she just
Right.
steamrollers the poor kid.
Right.
But it does say that even the totally innocent are easily corrupted. And that's the thing I think that he was driving at with war. It just comes in and it just literally, you know, no pun intended, it just invades. Like violence and war just invades our society. And we're not, like, that's why we need, you know, that sort of Lewis's, you know, kind of small c conservatism, where you need tradition to fall back on. The individual can't really handle it, you know, so you don't want to be like libertarians. No, that's too much individuality. You need rock solid institutions like churches and governments and things that are properly set up, populated by the good people.
Right.
The good creatures.
That's the key. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Lewis is like, know the good people and the good critters and follow them. You know, don't always trust everything that's coming your way and what you happen to quote unquote think about something, because that can be dangerous.
Yeah, I think the other thing I want to pick up on that relationship or that interaction between the White Witch and Edmund is that in the land of Narnia, where it's always winter and never Christmas, there's no room for human flourishing. And the witch looks at Edmund and every human and everything around her as an object to be manipulated, to be controlled,
used
for her goal, used as an object. And of course, that's exactly what goes on in a war a lot of the time, right? Soldiers just cannon fodder. Remember, he fought in the trenches of World War I. He felt that way, that he was just an object to be used for purposes that he didn't understand and that he came to believe were meaningless in the end. So I think there's a lot of that going on in the story as well, is that war prevents human flourishing. It forces people to freeze in a posture or position that is unhuman or inhumane, and it makes people corruptible because they're easily manipulated.
Yeah, absolutely. And but that's the complexity, right? It both can show who we really are, it corrupts who we really are, and I like what you're saying in the sense that it is a purely objectifying machine, right? It completely, you know, it commodifies everything. Like war is the ultimate machine that just, you know, turns everything into an object. And that's interesting because Lewis says in, I think it's Surprised by Joy, he says that one of the things that he got out of his wartime experience was when he did see death right in front of him. At first, it didn't really resonate, right? He was sort of like the shock of it all. But he said later on, it helped him understand Immanuel Kant. And this notion of an inner self. Like he went into a bunch of sort of technical Kantian jargon, but he went into understanding more deeply the nature of ethics and how it's not just purely physical, that there is a more complex side to human life. And that's where he started to have a major influence on Lewis in terms of religion and seeing people as souls and not as bodies. Right? So that's what war, you know, had a transformative effect on Lewis's thinking, to actually make him become less of a physical thinker and more of a religious thinker as well. But that happens to a lot of people who have those kinds of experiences.
Right.
Indeed.
Interesting.
Yeah, the ultimate objectification, you know, it's something that you can't tolerate. Your brain just turns right away from it.
Right. And Ian, I know, I mean, this time around you're playing Mr. Tumnus, one of the most interesting characters, because he is conflicted over what to do. And we talked last time too about, you know, this is a post-World War II story, and you can't help but see the parallels of whether or not you're going to hand over the sought-after person to the White Witch and her army, or whether you're going to harbor them and secretly, you know, in your room. And it seems obviously and direct to what went on in World War II.
Yeah.
But you have some interesting thoughts, I know, about a character like that. caught in the middle of this great war, you know.
Yes, and I mean, this is another way that war can affect characters and can affect people. And the way I view Tumnus at the beginning of the story is a survivor. He's doing the job the White Witch gave to him because he has to do that to survive, and he's in survival mode. He, after meeting Lucy, decides he can't go through with it, and he chooses love, you know, in place of survival. He chooses to put himself at risk to protect someone else, to protect Lucy. So I think at a deeper level, that's just something, like a way we were talking about how war can really change people and affect people in many ways. And I think that sort of instinct of, I have to do what I'm told now, is the way that it can do that to some people. I also just want to point out too, I think Tumnus is like, when all the children finally get to Narnia, and they go to meet Mr. Tumnus because Lucy wants to introduce him to her brothers and sisters, and then they are encountered with what happens to somebody who disobeys the witch. Right away, they find his house in ruin and him gone and taken captive.
Right.
And so...
And that fear, that would elicit complete fear.
And that fear, and everybody except Edmund sees that for what it is, and I think sees that tyranny, but of course Edmund is still under the effect, so he doesn't see that blatant sign right in front of him.
Interesting.
And so
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because at the time, Edmund's convinced the witch is good. A queen. She's a queen. Yeah. She's not a witch. She's a queen.
And he must have did something wrong. Thomas must have did something wrong because you can't wrong the queen, sort of thing.
Right.
But ultimately, I guess, going back to war, I think Mr. Tumnus, in that survival state, in that like prolonged emergency state that Narnia is stuck in under this tyrannical leader, he's doing what he can to survive. He's trying to hold on to his ordinary life in a way because he serves tea and that sort of thing. Right.
No, he is a beautiful character, and he gets such an arc of redemption and all that, and so does Edmund, of course. Edmund's such a redemptive character. And the others don't go through that, but it's interesting. And so coming back, of course, to war, I mean, I continue to have questions about it as I know the story so well, and George and Ian, you'll remember too the way we had mounted the production in 2018. I think there were like 3 battle scenes, of which I recall one of them being literally and physically fought between Peter and the wolf. This is just what we decided to do, because like, how do you feature these giant battle scenes on stage? And we thematically, sort of dramaturgically, decided that the battle was battle of the hearts and souls and minds of Narnians. And so we, theatrically staged things less physically and more symbolic, I could say. And we used music and singing to battle it out. And then at one point, Ian literally fought with a sword and killed Fenris Ulf. In a more realistically staged scene. And then there was some other back and forth
choreographed of movement between the two sides, back and forth.
Because we struggled to really, how do you convey the epicness of this with people getting, it's almost like a shallow version of it, like knowing, Fenris Ulf gets killed, but and Aslan gets killed, and that's the only people that seem to get killed, at least in the play version. So we're not faced with a lot of death, I suppose, even though war is riddled with it.
Well, I've never quite thought of that, but correct me, but if I'm wrong here, but I don't think Lewis really talks a lot about carnage, like the aftermath of battles, right? I don't recall that. Right? No. Like he'll say, there's a big battle and it was bad, but you don't really get, gory descriptions or nope. I think there's a few, but not in general. Is there really in Narnia?
I think he does, not in Narnia, you're right, but he does talk about it in The Weight of Glory. He talks about war quite a bit.
Yeah.
And to go back to your earlier point, he saw it as inevitable. It was a part of the human condition that we would always devolve into war, into conflict. And there was no way around that other than to give up the vengeance principle, to give up this, again, back to ethics. How then will we live? And, he lived during the bloodiest, most murderous century in history, right? 25 to 50 million soldiers died, 200 to 300, 400 million civilians died during the 20th century. And, he thought a lot about that. So he came to the view, at least in Weight of Glory, as I understand it, that war is a diminishing of humanity, that it only represents the materialist worldview, that all there is to life is this, what's in front of us, in terms of what we can understand through our senses, and that war, that's how war objectifies people to a large extent. And we've talked a lot about the White Witch, but we shouldn't forget the central role of Aslan. He represents the hope of breaking that cycle of war and poverty and the power or the lust for land and power and territory and ego and all that kind of stuff, right? That Aslan represents an alternative to that. And by implication, the Christian worldview offers an alternative to this endless cycle of violence and war and the vengeance principle.
What I find interesting, too, is Aslan dies. They kill him. The witch's army kills him. Spoiler alert. And and he resurrects. Spoiler alert again. He rises from the dead. And you would think, at least sort of you would think, okay, the story's over. Like, wow, that's powerful. And why couldn't Aslan simply just sing a big high note and decimate the witch's army and we're done? But interestingly enough, physical battling must take place despite him having conquered death and the deep magic. And I find that sort of interesting that the symbolic, important soul thing took place here. Yet the battle's just not over. The war is still needs to be fought. The physical one, at least. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, on the other hand, I think Lewis does say in places in his correspondence, that you don't want to read too much of an allegory into everything to try and map it on completely to Christianity.
Right.
So, because there's lots of things that don't really match that well.
Right.
But
the talking animals, for one.
Well, there's that. But I'm just thinking, like even the Christian story. But the big picture does map on, because eventually, these things are transcended, right?
Right.
These horrible aspects of human existence, there is an escape, right? Christianity, you guys are mentioning, it offers an alternative to these endless cycles. So yes, we may come to discover something about ourselves. We objectify all these kinds of things. We learn what we're capable of, but then we become something better in the end, and we manage to go through that little door at the end, and we can escape from it. So. But I think one of the things, just to go back to what you were talking earlier about the just war theory and sort of the conclusion of war and the end of war, one of the things that the just war tradition was concerned with was to try and put the brakes on vengeance.
Oh.
Right? So not only did you have to justify why you went into war, so there was a justice for war, jus ad bellum, as they used to say in Latin, but there was also how you behaved in war.
Right.
Jus in bello, like justice in war. And that was the key thing that had to be observed. That was developed later in the Christian tradition as well, and the secular version of
like
just
how
war.
to treat prisoners, how to...
No torturing.
Like that kind of thing,
And also certain kinds of weapons. Like in the Middle Ages, the church was trying to ban crossbows and all kinds of things because it was... And today, what's our debate?
Right.
Cluster bombs.
Right. And
right?
biological...
That's a just in bello discussion. Jus in bello discussion. No cluster bombs. You're going to war, but you can't use those things. Why? They're just too nasty. That's beyond the pale for it. And why? Because if you use these things, you're going to set it up where the war will never end. Right? So if you and I are opposing armies, and I've mistreated your soldiers in prison, and the war is over, you're going to say it's not over.
It's not over. I want revenge. I want to escalate.
It's never over until you pay for what you did.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So a lot of that tradition was trying to not only limit getting into war and look for alternatives, because one of the key things was war is always a last resort. But when you're in it, let's keep the violence down as much as we can so we don't create a cottage industry of war where it just never ends. Right? So that's a very prominent thing in the tradition that I think Lewis and Tolkien were picking up on too, that war, trying to put the brakes on war is part of Christianity as well. Right? Sort of accepting it and confining it and then maybe eventually escaping it.
It seems like most wars in my memory don't end cleanly or well. I mean, I don't even know how to say that, but it seems like, once again, just my opinion, it seems like the last war that, I don't know, that was fought, that accomplished something good, of course, that's always debatable, was World War II. And it just seems like since then, there's been a lot of declared wars and different things that just ended weirdly or badly and just kind of ended in sort of a pointless sort of conclusion. And I've certainly spoken with veterans who went to more recent wars and overseas for Canada, and certainly now just say what the heck was the point of that, and they would never want to go again, and they resent that they went, they regret that they went, and it seems more common than one would think. But of course, when they went, they felt there was a reason and they believed it. And I feel like it's so sad, right, to like come after war and be like, ugh, why did we do that? Which is not the case for the Pevensey children. Of course, they could see the results of their actions and the happiness of Narnians. So they had a very different outcome, I guess. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what you're pointing out is that war itself in history has changed, right? Not only the way it's fought, but for the reasons. What was, and if you look at the just war tradition, what was regarded as a justification for war, that has changed over the centuries. We don't really accept territorial disputes, right? And that's why a lot of people, disagree with what's going on with the Russian action in Ukraine. We don't really say, well, just because you're mad about a boundary, you don't get to invade someone.
Right.
That's not a justification anymore. That used to be regarded as justification, right? So those things have changed.
What's acceptable justification changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That just shows you that what the grounds of a good argument, those change over time, right? And they change in the sciences, they change everywhere. So it's not just in ethics. So in science, in mathematics, the nature of the grounds of a good argument, they have changed over, right? So even in math, you find, certain things that were regarded as stable, later on were questioned and different foundations were put in place. So this idea of what underpins what we accept changes. And so it's not surprising that what we accept as a good war will change, right? And you're right about the when you say your intuitions about the Second World War being a good war, right? You're certainly not alone in saying that.
Yeah.
Many people do, but there are some
like in
questions.
retrospect, seems like it was just.
It does seem
and
that
thank
way.
goodness people fought.
Did what they
think,
did. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
what you're trained to think at least.
That's right. But there are some scholars that that war too was questionable. Things should have been done earlier to prevent
Right.
and whatnot. And that of course raises all other kinds of complications of what do you do to anticipate.
Right.
Right.
So
So what allies should have done and they didn't, and then they just sort of let things build up, and then they said we got no choice. Well, yeah, but you had choices earlier that you ignored. So I mean that complicates the discussion as well. But you're quite right that the nature of war has changed. Like what's going on, we sometimes call them police actions now and things like that. Yeah, it's different. And so the thinking about it, and veterans afterwards have different thoughts about it. It's a very dynamic and complex kind of beast, this thing we call war.
Yeah, and I learned. I remember learning from you, George, years ago. You said something controversial. At least people would think it is controversial. That most wars are not fought over religion, whereas a lot of people believe that most wars are over time and over history have been fought over religion. And then, but your theory was that's not true, that most wars are fought for so many other reasons. Do you want to quickly elaborate on that and what you meant by that, George?
If I go back to the conflicts in the 20th century, the greatest losses or death of people occurred not by religious people, not by Christians so much, but by atheists like Stalin and Hitler and Mao Tse-tung and Pol Pot. These people were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions, hundreds of millions in total. Whereas, the people tend to point towards the Northern Ireland War, right, between Protestants and Catholics as a religious war. I would argue it's an economic war largely, but people would use that as an example of a religious war, or the Crusades. But in Northern Ireland, about 5,000 to 6,000 people died. In the Crusades, I think it was even less than that. So more murder in war has been committed by atheists than by religious people.
Right, or fought over things not religious. Or
Right.
do you agree with that?
They don't
Richard,
really fight over ideas. We tend to fight over land and property and economic conditions, money and
Right.
ego, megalomaniacs like Napoleon.
Right. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well,
or?
I think that it's always difficult to pinpoint causes of war, right?
Yeah.
Because, I know what you're saying, and in terms of war is fought over a variety of things. Wars are fought over a variety of things. But when you think about, let's go back to the so-called good war, right? The World War II. Some historians would say it's very artificial to say World War I and World War II.
Because it's name it that, you mean?
Yeah, we talk about it like that. And of course, before World War II, they called World War I the Great War.
Right.
To end all wars.
To end all wars. Unless you're super pessimistic. That's World War I.
Yeah.
Right? That would have been
boy.
wild if anyone said that then. But so some historians say, this is just, the long war, right? That we have been largely warlike creatures for centuries. And all these wars are ultimately interrelated. You don't really understand why World War II got off the ground without really understanding how World War I ended, right? And all the ramifications, right? So we can go through all that, what happened at the Treaty of Versailles, and how the Nazis exploited all this stuff, right? So it's very difficult to say, even think of what, we've heard in a variety of this conflict, again, to bring it to the present context. Think about some of the stuff that's been said about the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, right? You get some people saying, well, it's inevitable, it's a long-term relationship, and it's almost kind of like this family squabble and things like that, which I don't think that's right, but you've got very different interpretations on what the cause of this is.
Yeah.
So but I know what you're saying. It's very difficult to pin down really when wars start, really when they end. Right. These, as many historians will say, these are semi-arbitrary decisions as to when an event really begins and when it really ends. But most wars tend to really conclude diplomatically, right? They tend to conclude through sheer exhaustion,
like
attrition.
Just enough is enough, kind of thing.
Just kind of like the way some of these large major powers, they occupy and then they just went, well, I guess we're done.
We're done,
leaving, going home.
Yeah.
A lot of that happens.
Yeah.
And that. I was listening to a few historians predict that that's probably what could happen even in the current conflict in Ukraine.
Fatigue.
Fatigue will set in, attrition, all that kind of stuff, and then you'll get some kind of demilitarized zone like you have between the Koreas. Something like that.
And what we see in fiction, in a story like Lion, in which the wardrobe is once the leader was killed, once the White Witch was over, it was over. The war was over. Sure. But it's almost so simple, right? But I think, children and adults alike, we sometimes want that and crave that simplicity, that final ending. Yeah. The good guys win. The Narnians get their land back. It feels nice and good. But I think if I hear what you're saying is in real life, it's just never quite like that. It's so much more complicated in the end, Yeah,
well, you think about the way the Lord of the Rings ends, right? It's sort of like that, but then, there is a long sort of decay that's coming in, right? Once all this conflict and everything's over, society just becomes this static sort of kind of heat death, right? And everything just calms down and there's really no history anymore. So I don't know what that really says, but I would say something dark about humanity.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Any final words, George, about War and Peace in Narnia before we conclude?
I don't have any final words about it. I just hope that by talking about War and Peace in the context of the story, that when people come to the show, they will appreciate more the story and what's going on in it.
Right. Thank you. And what about you, Ian? Any final thoughts on our topic today?
I guess I'll conclude, I think on a micro level or sort of much smaller level, the children that go through the story of Narnia, when we first meet them, they're fighting and bickering with one another. And then about halfway through when they get to Narnia and they meet Aslan, they sort of stop fighting and bickering to one another, and that leads to great prosper. So I think maybe
cooperation.
Yeah, cooperation and not fighting. And there are just wars, and certainly some evils need to be stamped out. But I also think prosper needs to come from cooperation and stopping fighting.
Wow, excellent point. Good insight. And Richard, any final words on this topic?
Well, I've got to agree with that point about where, even though you can make some kind of argument that history and it shows that some things have come out of war, that, you know, developments or whatever, the best stuff always comes out of human cooperation, by far. I mean, there's just no replacement for that. That's where we are at our finest. And I think that's one of the things that the Narnia stories try to get across, right? And that's probably arguably one of the central messages of Christianity. It's really community cooperation. That's really where our true natures lie.
Well said. And with that, we'll end our discussion. And it was great having you, George, back with us. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Ian McMullen, it was great having you back with us.
Yes, anytime.
And Richard Feist, it was just wonderful having you as our guest today. Thank you very much.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This has been Telling the Story, a podcast dedicated to exploring faith, spirituality, arts, and culture, hosted by Ninth Hour Theatre Company, located in Ottawa, Canada. Thank you for joining us for our first podcast series discussing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. You can listen again to this and all our podcasts through our website, ninthhour.ca. That's number 9th-hour.ca. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is performing live in Ottawa, Canada at the Shankman Arts Centre in the East End, December 14th to 17th, and the Meridian Theatres at Centrepoint in the West End, December 19th to 23rd. For tickets and showtimes, visit our website, follow the links in the description, or go directly to the theater's website or box office. Most shows sell out, so book your tickets in advance. If you've enjoyed our podcast and want to participate in similar discussions, please join us live in December for some pre-show discussions before some of the shows. Be sure to follow us and subscribe on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Until next time, remember, Aslan is on the move.